contributing to this book. And so you have different perspectives on all of these topics, really, from people all over Europe. And I'm just going to go briefly over each of the chapters. I'm going to just show you this little preview with a couple of slides that I think are important markers of what is in each chapter. So let me start about this idea of rewilding and abundant landscapes in Europe. So rewilding is a concept that has now a few years, and you know it has different meanings for different people, and it has different meanings in different countries. But you know, overall, you know, if you plot rewilding as a management strategy in these two axes of active management versus passive management, where man is constantly intervening in the landscape actively, either, for instance, through mowing or through using livestock or through cutting the forest. And if you have passive management, where mainly you let the processes go, rewilding is on the passive management side. So you just let the ecological processes take place by themselves, and you know, humans kind of step back, and it's really a decrease in the human footprint in the landscape. And then if you have in terms of farmland use, so how much use you have from the landscape in terms of productivity, it's also productivity for farming. Rewilding is also in a very low use or even no use of landscape for farmland production. And this contrasts with other strategies that we have now in Europe, such as agricultural intensification, that is high farmland use, active management, or afforestation, where it is active management but low farmland use. Now, one of the key issues, as I already briefly touched, is what happened to biodiversity when you decrease land use intensity. And much of the European policy, for instance, on the common agricultural policy and the agro-environmental subsidies, and much of the conservation community has been really concerned with what is believed to be this relationship between land use intensity and biodiversity in Europe. And more or less is this hump-shaped relationship where you have, of course, very low levels of biodiversity for intensive agriculture, but then the highest levels of biodiversity are achieved for extensive agriculture with low perturbation levels. And then when wilderness comes back, then you know this relationship can, this biodiversity can decrease. And so this has been a big concern, and there has been lots of, for instance, agro-environmental subsidies that have been designed to halt ecological succession, halt rewilding because of the concern with biodiversity. Now, what we hypothesized in this chapter, and this is really a reprint of an earlier paper that Leticia Navarro and I did a couple of years ago, is that really, if you look at the local scales, very small plots where many of these ecological studies are done, this hump-shaped relationship does show up. But it's very unclear what happens at larger scales. If you look at 100 square kilometers, 10,000 square kilometers, it's not clear that the same pattern will hold. And what we think is that then you have natural perturbations taking place. You have natural perturbations such as fire, such as a storm, such as large herbivores grazing. And these perturbations kind of recreate these low intensity perturbations that you have in extensive agriculture, and so you really maintain biodiversity. And not only that, you know, when you look at the hump-shaped relationship, you can always ask, you know, where all these species were before we had extensive agriculture, because they were here. You know, some species did arrive with the colonization of modern man, but, you know, overall, what we have really is that many species are not even here anymore. So if you look at the historical levels of biodiversity in regional scale, what we really had since the arrival of modern man was many extinctions. Many species are not longer here. Now, the next chapter in the book is about what we call European wilderness in time of farmland and abandonment. And what we try to do here, this is a chapter by Sylvie Chelsea and several other co-authors, is look at different ways of mapping and identifying wilderness in Europe. And here we have a map using two different approaches. One is based on the appropriation of net primary productivity, the one on the left. So how much use we are making of the land, where you see, for instance, that in northern France or Germany or the UK, we are appropriating significant amounts of primary productivity from the ecosystem. The graph on the right is about a distribution of artificial lights, artificial night lights. And those are, let's say, there are two dimensions. We map other dimensions of biodiversity, so like remoteness, how remote a place is. We map also how climaxic an ecosystem is, so how far from late successional ecosystems we are at each place. So these are, let's say, different dimensions of wilderness, and there is some consistency across them, as you'd expect. You know, in many cases, the areas where you have more artificial lights correspond to urban areas, areas around roads, and that's also where sometimes you have higher levels of human appropriation of net primary productivity, or at least around those areas. But there is also differences in these different dimensions, and they really are telling you different things about wilderness. Another thing we looked at was at how, if you look at the ongoing process of abandonment, where is it happening? And this is the map on the right-hand side. And how does it overlap with Natura 2000 and protected areas in Europe? And if you look at this map, although there is no full match, the Natura 2000 is much wider than the areas where, or is much larger than the areas where abandonment is occurring. Much of these occurrences of abandonment are really happening in these areas of Natura 2000 protected areas, national systems. The next chapter is about the benefits that we obtain from wilderness and rewilding. And this is to assess the benefits, we look at different ecosystem services, such as timber production, carbon sequestration. And in the left hand side, we have a ranking of ecosystems, of importance of various ecosystem services. The darker red areas are the most important. And the right-hand side, we have a wilderness quality index developed by the team of Steve Carver for Europe. And what you find again that there is some overlap, and to look at this even with more detail, we have provisioning and regulating services here in this map. Provisioning are services that you use, such as timber production or farming, and regulating are services that are, you just take the benefit from it without using it. It's or indirect use, such as climate regulation, carbon sequestration, and others. And what you see is that if you look at the abundant land areas in Europe that are becoming important areas for rewilding, they are not that important for ecosystem services, but for provisioning some services, but they can be really important for regulating services. Then we have the next part of the book is about biodiversity, as I told you, about biodiversity and rewilding. And we already heard this morning, again in the presentation and in the report that Franz just showed you, that was published 2 weeks ago, about this important wildlife comeback in Europe. What is good news overall? Because, you know, in the environmental community, you have been giving a lot of bad news over many decades. And here we have good news, you know, for many species, because of farmland abandonment, because of regulations to protect those species, because of decreasing in hunting pressure and so on. They are coming back. And these are 3 examples. This is the current distribution of the bear, the wolf, and the lynx. And all of those 3 species are expanding, either in numbers or in range, in much of its range. Now, this chapter is also the first example of how different people or different scientists think differently about rewilding. For instance, this is a chapter written by Luigi Boitani and Lionel. And what happens is that, for instance, they argue that more important than bringing back wilderness is bringing back what they call wildness in ecosystems. So, for instance, more important than bringing populations back to levels that were here before humans occupied these landscapes. They argue that the most important is that we are able to, in a very densely continent, in a very densely occupied continent by humans, to be able to bring wildlife in coexistence with humans. And so, again, one of the things that we are doing in this book is bringing different perspectives of how to rewild Europe, how to bring more nature into Europe. And different scientists will have slightly different takes, and that comes alive when you read through these chapters. The next chapter is by Nara Cortes and colleagues, and this is about something that we also heard a talk yesterday, a very nice talk, about the role of carcass ecology and the natural carcass dynamics, and it's really an interesting system where you have several species of birds of prey, for instance, that facilitate each other in eating these carcasses. You know, not all of the species can really, for instance, open these carcasses. So some species will open carcasses and facilitate the access of other carcasses. And there is, let's say, this almost mutualistic relationship between these different birds. But one of the things that has been changing over the last years is because some of these populations of vultures and other birds of prey have been declining. There's been a lot of concern in feeding them, also because there was not many carcasses available for them in the wild, both because of low wildlife numbers and because of regulations that don't let farmers leave carcasses in the wild. You have to bring them to a collection because there were concerns of epidemics and so on. So a lot of feeders, of vulture feeders, have been placed all around Europe to support these populations. And those vulture feeders that you have here an example in the bottom photo really changed the community dynamics, these interactions between these different birds of prey that eat on these carcasses. And this is an example of conservation action that was an emergency conservation action. So many of these populations were really depressed, and they really needed support, but that now is having some unexpected, maybe unintended consequences. on the balance between the different species, because, for instance, they have been favoring griffon vultures in contrast with, for instance, Egyptian vultures that have different strategies. So this chapter examines these problems, what we know about the ecology of these systems, and the need again to have more natural processes, to leave the carcasses of livestock as possible in the landscape, to have higher numbers of wildlife, of wild herbivores in the landscape, and to move away progressively in the rewilding areas at least from vulture feeders. And another thing that the chapter also emphasizes is on how we also have a growing interest in wildlife in Europe and all the ecosystem services associated to these vultures and scavenger populations that we are benefiting from, including, of course, the process of them eating the carcasses. It's also an important ecosystem service that these scavengers deliver to us, but also the recreation, also the opportunity to watch this incredible wildlife in action. And yeah, this is just a diagram of all of these interactions that the carrion facilitates. It has a good impact on invertebrates because it increases diversity of invertebrates. It can feed several vertebrate populations, and it also has, and we also heard that about that yesterday. It also has impact on vegetation, because the nutrients that are released by the decomposition of that carcass stay in the soil and promote floristic diversity. And so it has permanent impacts in the soil. So it's very important to understand how these natural processes take place. And this is very different from doing it in a vulture feeder or across the landscape in a natural process. The next chapter is about what happens in a taxa that perhaps doesn't grab as much attention. And these are mosses. And the choice of mosses and butterflies was not really casual. And what we're trying to tell here a story is that if you look at different taxa, you look at rewilding dynamics, you look at the forest coming back in many places as these landscapes have been really deforested over millennia, and now the forest is increasing in many places. And there's a concern that, for instance, forest farmland birds may diminish or decrease, that some plant species that are associated with these open landscapes may diminish or decrease. But those are good news for mosses, for instance. For mosses, and this is a graph illustrating a study that Thomas Merckx did in an area that is undergoing farmland abandonment, is that if you go to woodland, that's where you have some of the highest species diversity. Not only that, if you look at the larger spatial context of the landscape, so if you are in a still used agricultural land or if you are in a forested area, you see that this taxa really enjoys the forest. And you see that this is an effect that even becomes stronger as you increase your landscape scale. That's the issue that I mentioned, that you have to look at large landscape scales and not only small scales. Next chapter is by José Rebenais, that is here today, and James Bullock. And again, this is a chapter about a different approach to rewilding or to bringing vegetation back, and something that they have been working over many years. And they have these beautiful diagrams illustrating that process. And you have, let's say, a landscape like you can find today in much of Southern Europe. In the top, no forest or very little forest, just confined in the tops of the mountains, and not a really high level of structural elements in the landscape. And what they propose is that you should prepare this landscape to be more biodiversity friendly, to be more also rewilding friendly, by, for instance, planting hedgerows, by recovering river forests, by even in urban landscapes, by bringing more trees into urban landscapes, like, for instance, roundabouts. And they have been proposing this idea that you can have this idea of woodland islets, where instead of trying to plant to continuous plantations that are not really good for biodiversity, they are very expensive to make, just plant some islets, some islands of tree species in the landscape, and then let the natural process, let the rewilding happen, where these trees will disperse naturally from those islets and occupy the landscape. And so this is really, I think this is really interesting approach that also maintains some of the options back. For instance, in the right-hand side of this graphic, if you want to use still the landscape for farmland production, you can use it, or if you need to reuse it, because you just have these islets and hedgerows, but you still have land available. But meanwhile, in between, if you don't need that land, it will just restore itself. And you have to understand that in many of these landscapes, one of the main limitations for rewilding is the seed bank. The seed bank is not there anymore, and these woodland islets may allow us to recover the seed banks. The other chapter examines a very interesting question, that is, how do you maintain disturbance-dependent habitats? We heard that about half of the species in Europe are associated with open habitats. Not necessarily completely dependent, but they use those open habitats. And some of them are really completely dependent on open habitats. And so what we looked at was that first, what is the history of forests in cover in Europe? And this is work by Jed Kaplan, and he has reconstructed the history of land use in Europe. And you see that over time, we went from, let's say, over the last 8,000 years, we went from a landscape where there was no human appropriation of landscape, they had large forests, but above all, there was no appropriation of use by man, to a landscape where you have huge appropriation of the landscape by humans, and where we have this huge footprint. And rewilding is really about decreasing this footprint in the landscape. And what we also did, we also looked at the species richness of the megafauna that are one of the critical players on maintaining this disturbance-dependent species, because the large herbivores do open space, do halt partially ecological succession. And these are some of the areas where you have still some high numbers of large mammal species, the red areas in this map. So the final part of the book is about how do you get this done? We can talk about the science of rewilding, the different concepts that people have about rewilding, from the emphasis on natural processes, on stepping back and letting the natural process take place, to reintroducing species that are missing, that went recently extinct. There are different dimensions to rewilding, but we can just talk about it or can do something about it. So we invited people also that are trying to do something about it. And the first the Rewilding Europe project, where this is really an amazing project. And the disclaimer: I'm part of it, so I have to say nice things. But no, it's really an amazing project where across right now 6 sites in Europe, and the goal is going to 10 sites. Rewilding Europe is trying to rewild about 1 million hectares by really precisely getting all these ecosystem natural processes going on. And it involves not only conservation use issues, but also enterprise issues, how you get people to benefit from this rewilding through tourism opportunities, through businesses that are related to rewilding. And also how can you communicate this to the wider public and communicate this to the communities that live in these landscapes. And at the core of all of these activities of Rewilding Europe are the local rewilding partners. The Rewilding Europe Foundation has a central team that is even distributed across Europe, but then there are the different partners, the different organizations across these rewilding locations that are doing the on-the-ground work of rewilding landscapes. Then the next chapter is about protecting wilderness in Europe, existing wilderness. That's what the Pen Parks Network has been doing over the last few years, where they designed a system of certification of protected areas. And this was, I think, it was also a very important step in European conservation, because much of the conservation in Europe was dominated by, let's say, management of these landscapes. And Pen Parks came about certifying protected areas that were letting some wilderness to still occur and some wild processes to occur. And this is the last 2 slides. And the last chapter is about from Judith's Jobs and co-authors. Is about this experience that they are having in this Erasmus intensive program on bringing entrepreneurship to the rewilding areas, and through teaching, and what is the contribute of teaching in doing that. And this is a figure that Judith showed yesterday, where it's very clear that as scientists, at least natural scientists like myself, publish a lot on many issues, but not really on entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is not mentioned in natural science publications. You have to go to social sciences really to look at entrepreneurship. And but this question of rewilding is a social ecological issue. You have to look both at the social dimension of it and the ecological dimension of it. And so that's what Judith and colleagues are doing, are trying to train a new generation of biologists, of entrepreneurs that can bridge across these 2 fields, from business opportunities to conservation. And I think it's really important. So if you are interested, if you think this is interesting for you, please come back to Springer later this year and order your copy. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Henrique. That was very interesting. I'm certainly looking forward to that book coming out. Because we've got this session missing later on in this section, I think we'll have a few questions now, even though we're running over time slightly. I hope that's not detaining anyone from being elsewhere. So if anyone has any questions, now would be a good time. No? Okay, well, I thought there was a lot of interesting information there. I don't know, do you see, okay, I think skill came up as an interesting issue to deal with, and I was wondering, do you have any concept of measuring biodiversity change for rewilding and improvements, risks, opportunities, over what kind of time scale should we be looking at in geographic scale?
Yeah, I only really mentioned spatial scale, but time scale is also obviously very important. And one of the things that we are now looking in my lab is to develop new approaches to biodiversity monitoring, and also in the context of rewilding, and how we can follow what is happening in different areas undergoing farmland abandonment. But briefly, you know, I don't think that just looking at plots of 0.1 hectares, that is what many plant ecologists do, will tell you a lot about these large-scale processes. You have to look at least at the kilometer square, and likely another kilometer square scale. And so you have to monitor different places in landscapes that size, look at the patterns of beta diversity. And again, also in terms of time scales, I think, you know, one of the problems that we face there is that what are the time scales that are relevant for management? Time scales relevant for management are on the order of 5 to 20 years. You know, if you go further than that, you're really pushing the edge on what is relevant for management. And so we do have to monitor at least what happens at those time scales. And then we can also produce models for what is likely to happen at longer time scales. And so I think we have to both integrate long-term monitoring, but also modeling about what is likely to happen in longer time scales.
Oh, yes, please.
Indeed, thank you very much. Really looking forward to get the book. One aspect I think that you didn't touch upon, and maybe it's in the book, I don't know, is the legal aspect of the whole rewilding approach. I mean, as you know, Europe has got some of the best nature conservation legislation. The Birds and Habitats Directive have been terrific. In fact, some of the wildlife comeback that we have seen are partly due to that terrific legislation. We all also know that the Birds and Habitats Directive are under constant attack by a number of sectors. So what are the implications of this new approach on the Birds and Habitats Directive in specific terms, and in European nature conservation legislation in general terms? And I think this should also be addressed in such a general overview of the rewilding approach.
Oh, that's an excellent question. And there is a chapter that I didn't show you that will touch on that. It's the last chapter in the book. And you know, there are a couple of things that are important to say about that. First is that, in a way, the Birds Directive was drafted in the 70s and the Habitats Directive in the 80s. You know, we have now 40 years of conservation experience and ecological thinking. And at the given moment, I think we'll have to promote some reform of the thinking that was behind the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive. And I think the rewilding community can help there. For instance, the traditional approach in the Habitats Directive was very much a phytosociological approach of describing communities and this idea that you have to maintain these communities as they are, and not so much on the ecosystem processes and on the ecological dynamics of those communities. And now, say that we have made a huge amount of progress with these two directives in Europe. We have very important achievements, and we have to build on that. And we cannot really go backwards in terms of losing what we're able to achieve. And then we also have a legal framework where we have to operate. So there are certain things that we have to do that are constrained by the existing legal framework. So all of those issues, I think, are really important, and I think that's a particular issue there is, for instance, the current divide now in the legislation about what happens when you reintroduce a species that's considered to be a wild species, let's say like the chamois, or a deer, or a species like livestock, like cattle, or horses that are domestic species. And that has very clear consequences on the legislation. One of the things I think Rewilding Europe will have to do, and other organizations working in this field, is to push for reform of that legislation, because otherwise we'll not be able to have really horses in the wild state outside, let's, for instance, enclosures. And so all of those issues become really relevant, and again, we'll touch on some of that in this chapter that I don't mention, and it was an excellent question.
Thanks very much. I think we'll keep on going now. But Rewilding Europe have asked me to pass on a book of the Oryx Born to be Wild book to speakers. So, Enrique, before you go. So now I'd like to invite Mats Nicholson to come and speak about rewilding and forestry. He's worked from the Swedish Foundation, the Nordic Ark. They have a 24-year-old breeding centre for endangered animals and reintroducing them, such as peregrine falcons, Amur leopards, and white-backed woodpecker, plus much more. And look forward to hearing